for the National Day of Action. And I'm going to say a few words introducing the Day of Action and then turn it over to our speakers and open it up for discussion and questions. The National Day of Action has been organized by over 75 higher ed unions, AAUP chapters, student debt organizers, and student organizations nationwide that have come together since December. And the list of participating campuses is still growing. I think it's going to go beyond 75, actually by a considerable amount. We've come together to push back against a coordinated national assault on the public and democratic mission of higher education. Attacks on both public and private colleges and universities that are designed to silence dissent and control what can be studied and discussed in the United States, and really to close off the promise of higher education as a public good. So we've seen attempts to repress research and teaching on African American studies, gender and sexuality, Israel and Palestine, and racism and imperialism. We've seen attempts to turn back the clock on gains in racial justice with, for instance, DEI bans. We're seeing structural attacks on higher education, long-term attacks to public funding of higher education, the casualization of labor, and rising levels of student debt, all of which undermine colleges and universities' ability to educate students, to support research that's necessary for a democratic society, and to fulfill their obligations as employers. And it's very important to note that these forms of restructuring affect all higher ed workers, from faculty to dining hall staff, and they have tremendous significance in regional and national economies that are increasingly organized around education and healthcare. We think that all of these threats are rooted in anti-democratic forms of governance, both at the university level and at the state and national levels, which have allowed politicians and corporate executives to interfere in colleges and universities, undermining the freedom to teach, research, learn, and really threatening the public and democratic mission of higher education. On April 17th, scores of unions, AAUP chapters, and student organizations from coast to coast will take action on their campuses to begin to turn the tables on this coordinated national assault and to build a movement together to create a system of higher education that serves the public good in a democratic society. Campuses are mobilizing around a unifying national message that's outlined in the statement you can find on our website called The Future We Stand For. And this statement links our local struggles with a set of demands that we are mobilizing for together. Demands for publicly funded higher education for all, freedom to teach and learn, job security and fair pay for everyone in higher ed, the right to assemble and protest, racial justice in higher education, and democratic governance of colleges and universities. And we understand unions to be essential instruments of democratic governance. The National Day of Action is a movement building event. It draws on the momentum of tens of thousands of higher ed workers who formed new unions over the past few years. And the process of organizing together for April 17th has created infrastructure and laid the groundwork for long-term national mobilization and political action together to reclaim the future of higher education in this country. The centerpiece of the National Day of Action will be local actions on campuses nationwide. At 5 p.m. Eastern Time, there's also going to be a live streamed national teach-in, and you can register for the teach-in on our website. I just want to highlight a few of the actions that are happening around the country that reflect the full diversity of higher ed, public and private institutions, community colleges and universities, and institutions far beyond the Ivy League that, of course, educate most students in the United States and have been ground zero for attacks on higher ed for decades. So, for instance, there are going to be important actions resisting austerity measures that are harmful to education. Rutgers, AAUP, AFT will be holding a strike-iversary event to commemorate their historic strike last spring, as well as a speak out leading to a march to administrators' offices to protest the elimination of classes and class size increases in the writing program, cuts that hurt students and harm the quality of education. At Wayne State University in Detroit, the Wayne Academic Union is currently in contract negotiations, and they've embraced the model of bargaining for the common good. So they're going to be holding a student-engaged action, highlighting the work that the union is doing in bargaining to address the needs of students who are facing housing insecurity. There are going to be actions defending the freedom to teach and learn. So The University of Nebraska at Lincoln AUP is organizing a banned book, table, and raffle. In 2023, there were over 1,200 demands to censor library books and materials in the US, and this is happening in Nebraska as well. So they are going to be raffling banned books on campus. In Tennessee, there's an incredible coalition of higher ed and K-12 educators, including those at the University of Tennessee at Martin and Tennessee Tech, who have been mobilizing together against the state's divisive concepts law. On April 17th, they're going to be organizing a statewide Zoom talk by Matthew Hahn, who's a K-12 teacher who was fired for bringing an essay by Ta-Nehisi Coates into his classroom. He was the first educator to lose his job under that law. This event is a great example of solidarity between higher ed and K-12 educators who are facing very much the same forms of political interference by state legislatures. There are going to be actions to defend racial justice and diversity in higher ed. United Academics of Oregon State University are going to hold a teach-in on moral panics and attacks on DEI. Lane Community College, the Lane Community College Education Association is going to hold a rally on April 17th, and they're organizing a petition from faculty, students, and community members to deliver to the Board of Education. They're protesting the fact that the DEI office at their campus has been dismantled, and racial discrimination complainants and union officers have been targeted for layoffs. There are going to be actions to end contingency and ensure job security that's necessary to quality education. The Wesleyan AAUP chapter has been conducting a very powerful one faculty campaign to end contingency, and they're going to be tabling on their campus on April 17th to build that campaign. There are going to be actions to support union organizing in higher ed on the understanding that winning on any of these issues requires building collective power and building a movement. So University of Faculty of Florida at Florida International University will be holding a panel on building higher ed unions in an environment of repression, and Florida is most assuredly an environment of repression. And at Penn, where I teach, 4 campus labor organizations are going to be holding a demonstration in support of grad worker unionization. This is just a little taste of what's coming on April 17th. There are a lot of other actions, including some very big ones that we can't actually announce publicly yet, but please stay tuned. There's going to be a lot happening. With that, I want to introduce our speakers, who are each going to speak for about 5 minutes, and we're just going to go through this in alphabetical order. So we'll start with Afjan Jafar, who is a professor of sociology at Connecticut College and the chair of the AAUP's Committee on College and University Governance, and she'll be speaking about attacks on DEI.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you all for being here. I will add that I also co-chaired the AUP special committee that looked into the Florida state system, public system, and also the University of North Carolina system. And so my remarks are shaped by the work I've done for the AUP and also the work I've done on my own campus and broader. So let's get to it. Why are we here today? Why are we organizing? A good number of people out there believe that professors have a nice, comfortable life, that we have it easy. So what are we so worked up about? I didn't grow up in this country. I spent the first 18 years of my life in Pakistan, where I grew up, and the majority of those years living under a military religious dictatorship. I know what censorship looks like in higher education, or K through 12, and I know what political interference looks like. And that's exactly what we're seeing in higher education in this country right now. I want to focus my remarks on 3 forms of censorship and interference in academia right now, as I see it. The first are the anti-DEI bills that are sweeping the nation. Second is the House Committee on Education and the Workforce and the various hearings and demands for documents that it has set forward. And the third is the bureaucratization of dissent through various policies on campus, usually events policies. Let me start with the anti-DEI bills. Nikole Hannah-Jones wrote on social media a couple of months back, "They say DEI because they can't say Black." These bills are a way to roll back centuries of racial progress and are intentionally and purposefully anti-Black. They are also anti any study of systemic forms of inequality. Combine these kinds of interferences with acts like removing entire boards and handpicking their replacements, as Tennessee has just done with Tennessee State University, which is an HBCU, or what Louisiana is currently considering, which is allowing the governor to handpick the chair of the boards for the state universities. And you have state legislatures exercising massive control over higher education in various states, and their scope of influence is constantly expanding. People assume that anti-DEI bills have to do with the offices of DEI or diversity statements or something very narrow along those lines. While that was certainly an initial focus, if you look at the range of anti-DEI bills now as they're currently being passed and implemented, you'll see that they now address all kinds of things, from DEI offices to divisive concepts, and also what they're calling political and social activism on campus. All of this now falls under DEI in the latest bills. The Alabama anti-DEI bill covers trans individuals' access to campus bathrooms. The Indiana bill specifically ties the likelihood of being exposed to other viewpoints to promotion, tenure, and retention. What is most alarming is that if you look at the language of these bills, it is clear that their agenda is to suppress dissent and those ideologies that challenge the status quo. In the Florida's anti-DEI policies, for instance, again, the phrase political or social activism is prohibited, right? It then goes on to define political and social activism as, this is a direct quote, any activity organized with the purpose of effecting or preventing change to a government policy, action, or function, or any activity intended to achieve a desired result to social issues. It goes on to clarify political or social activism does not include endorsement or promotion of a position that encourages compliance with state or federal law or Board of Governors guidance or regulation. This is the part that people aren't paying attention to. We're focused on the diversity statements and the offices of DEI, and we're not looking at the full scope of what these DEI bills are actually doing. The intent is to control what generations of students will be exposed to and what they'll be allowed to do, what they'll be allowed to study. It could not be any clearer once you start to look at the language of these bills. The second agent of concern that I mentioned when it comes to censorship and interference is the House Committee on Education and the Workforce. If you trace the work of this committee and its chair, Representative Virginia Foxx, you'll see that they've been after critical race theory and scholars of color before. They have specifically singled out Nikole Hannah-Jones, Bettina Love, Khalil Gibran Muhammad, who are all scholars of race and people of color, and they've mentioned them in their various committee hearings and opening remarks or sent letters to people saying that these people should be chastised in some way or not given jobs in the case of Nikole Hannah-Jones. Under the guise of their current anti-Semitism hearings, this committee has now brought its long-standing anti-CRT, anti-DEI agenda to private colleges. The many remarks by committee members make it completely explicit that they hold DEI and CRT responsible for the rise of anti-Semitism. And having framed it this way, the House Committee is now poised to make incursions into campus events and curricula on private campuses in unprecedented ways. So we see here an expansion of the scope of influence. While the legislation covering public universities and colleges coming from the legislature and DEI only really affects public universities and colleges, the House Committee has now found a way to ride their anti-DEI hobby horse right onto private campuses. But it would be more accurate to think of it not as a hobby horse, but a Trojan horse. They seek nothing less than the control of the curriculum and the knowledge that generations of students will be exposed to. And why do they do that? Representative Virginia Foxx said it best in her own words when she wrote an op-ed in 2021. This is a direct quote from her. When the federal government controls education, it controls society itself. Finally, there is one more area that I'll mention briefly that we need to pay attention to in terms of censorship and interference. and that is the bureaucratization of dissent and protest on college campuses. Events policies, policies around protest, and even acceptable use policies that determine what kinds of resources you can use on campus and so on, have been used to limit the actions and words of students and employees on campus, especially since October 7th. Because of pressure from donors, trustees, alums, and because of a desire to prevent a future scandal on their campuses, administrators are using mundane policies to manage dissent and dissenting views on their campuses. Barnard, American, Cornell, Michigan, these are all examples of institutions who've used such policies recently to curtail student and employee activism or protest or dissenting views. These policies are often not squarely within the purview of a particular constituent group on campus, nor are they typically being scrutinized by faculty closely. So they offer a good opening from an administrative point of view to control what is happening on campus. By putting in restrictions against the use of college resources, and this includes things like your office door, your dorm door, windows on buildings, or the requirement that banners and signs always be welcoming, dissent is being managed through minutia and mundane policy. It is a slow death by bureaucracy of free inquiry on our campuses, and we need to be just as vigilant about these policies as about other forms of interference that I mentioned earlier. Let me end here with where I began. Here's what people get wrong about protest and organizing in higher ed. When faculty protest or organize, it's not about us as individuals and whether we have a comfortable life or not. What we fight for affects all of us. Certainly, what we are fighting for in this climate affects all of us and affects generations of students to come. What is at stake is the survival of free inquiry, justice, and democracy in this country. That is what we're fighting for. That is what we stand for. Thank you all for coming. I'll turn it back to Amy now.
Thank you, Ashan. That was fantastic. I'm going to turn it over to our next speaker, who is Isaac Kamola, who is professor of political science at Trinity College and a specialist studying the influence of dark money in higher ed. He's the author of a book called Free Speech and Koch Money. Thanks, Isaac. Isaac, I think you're muted.
How many years? Thanks everybody for being here. I see a number of the journalists that I respect so much who've done amazing reporting on this issue of political influence in higher education, and I just want to thank you all for being here. In recent years, I've become a reluctant expert on dark money influence in higher education, and the lesson that I've learned is that what oftentimes appears to be spontaneous and organic and especially around particular right-wing views and libertarian views, that one can identify a political infrastructure behind it. And I think that looking for that political infrastructure is more important now as we look at the attacks on higher education than ever before. My own research draws upon more than a decade of excellent scholarship and investigative reporting by Theda Skocpol, Alex Hurdle-Fernandez, Nancy McLean, Jane Merritt, Ann Nelson, and others who have documented the small handful of exceptionally wealthy donors who lavishly spend on think tanks, media outlets, and academic centers. These donors make these political investments, and again, investments is their term, not mine, because they know that their minoritarian views do not have support within the marketplace of ideas without the construction of a large welfare state to keep their preferred ideas relevant. These are ideas that legitimize their obscene wealth, their political influence, and the political and social role of the white male elite hierarchy and political structures, a kind of counter revolt to the kinds of social processes and transformations that Afshan just talked about. In this political campaign, colleges and universities are oftentimes seen as obstacles to the political interests of that billionaire donor class. After all, within higher education operates through a process of peer review and not donor influence. There's a long history of this small group of donors that I examine in my research that it has been funded by tobacco companies, by fossil fuel companies, and others that have been critical or have been in which the research has demonstrated a negative aspects of their industry, and they would prefer that higher education was instead producing a different set of ideas than it one that it currently is. The result has been decades of efforts by billionaire donors to shape what takes place on college campuses. However, these efforts were punched into overdrive following the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020. For example, between May 26 and the end of June 2020, between 15 and 26 million Americans participated in Black Lives Matter protests. That's somewhere between 6 and 10% of the entire adult population of the United States. Demonstrations, approximately 2,700 in total, took place in 40% of countries across the country, counties across the country, including many in rural countries with large white majorities. And by June 2020, polling revealed that 67% of Americans supported the Black Lives Matter protests. In these protests, scholarly ideas about race, structural racism, gender, intersectionality, and social justice that had been developed over decades of research, peer review, critical analysis, hard work, and scholarship literally took to the streets. And in doing so, these protests pose an existential threat to the economic hierarchies that the think tanks and the political apparatus, the billionaire funded political apparatuses have been created to maintain. A good example of this is that the organizing ideology that these think tanks support is one that America is based on meritocracy, pull ourselves up from our bootstraps. Therefore, we need lower taxes. We need to decrease social services provided to poor people. And these arguments only make sense if you believe that there is a free market, that deregulation will lead to the public good. But in the Black Lives Matter protests, what happened was the great realization. My mom, my grandma started talking about structural racism, started talking about how, people's life expectancy is shaped by their race and by racial inequality. And these kinds of arguments really pose an existential threat to the billionaire donor class. And the ideas that undermine their justification, their political justification, became a challenge. To confront these grassroots donors, to confront the grassroots movement, wealthy donors and the think tanks they fund scrambled to develop a political response and found success in fomenting a culture war backlash against K-12 education and higher education. And they did so by harnessing that political machinery that they had already assembled. So what did this look like in practice? I think many people in the room know Christopher Rufo, who played an absolutely significant role in very strategically and cynically redefining critical race theory to mean any conversations of race that takes place within America. He called the critical race theory the perfect demon, the perfect villain. Right, that you could take any conversations of race and turn it into something that appears to be absurd. He was only able to do this, however, because of his positions within the Manhattan Institute, the Heritage Foundation, Pacific Research Institution, and the other dark money think tanks that he's a part of. In the last few years, the Manhattan Institute, Heritage Foundation, Claremont, and other think tanks have produced a deluge of documents, reports, op-eds, events, publications attacking CRT and DEI. They've also produced a lot of the model legislation. So the legislation that Afshan just pointed to about DEI, that comes from a model bill. A lot of those bills attacking DEI come from model legislation written by the Heritage Foundation, the Manhattan Institute, and likewise the bills that prevent the teaching of social justice activism or internships comes from Stanley Kurtz and his position within various think tanks. And Texas's ban on DEI, State Bill 17 or Senate Bill 17, was drawn directly from the Manhattan Institute's model legislation and adapted by the Texas Public Policy Foundation, which is a fossil fuel funded Texas think tank. And while 150 people came out to testify against the bill, there was only 4 politicians or 4 people who came out to support the bill, and those were representatives from the Texas Public Policy Foundation and Heritage, who in their testimony cited documents and reports by Heritage, Claremont, and other right-wing think tanks. What I'm demonstrating in my research is this broad, deeply integrated, well-funded network of think tanks that work together in order to make the appearance of a grassroots opposition to DEI, when in fact that opposition is largely astroturf from a small handful of incredibly well-funded organizations. In fact, Christopher Rufo acknowledged as much when asked by Politico about the role he played in the ouster of President Claudine Gay from Harvard. He bragged, quote, "I've run the same playbook on critical race theory, on gender ideology, and on DEI bureaucracy, the same playbook that he's now running on anti-Semitism. For the time being, given the structures of our institutions," let that sink in, "given the structures of our institutions," and here he's talking explicitly about the think tanks and dark money funded activist groups that he's a part of. This is a universal strategy that can be applied to most issues. I think that we've demonstrated that it can be successful. So I think that I'm really excited that the faculty are beginning and journalists and civil society are starting to recognize this dark money influence in all aspects of our politics, including higher education. And I'm really excited that at George Mason University, which is ground zero of Koch funding and dark money funding in higher education, there's going to be a protest on next week on the day of action. And George Mason University is just the perfect example of the effects of dark money, and a board of governors that includes two people affiliated with the Heritage Foundation, Lindsay Burke, who wrote the Heritage Foundation's 2025 or the Project 2025, which is the blueprint for the next Republican to president. That board of governors, Lindsay Burke, wrote the chapter on education, and it's quite chilling to see that vision. And I'm really excited that they'll be protesting on the day of action, holding a teach-in and additional meetings about how to organize to push back against efforts by Governor Youngkin to undermine the Just Society's core curriculum that was adopted by faculty, and now the right-wing think tanks and political machinery is pushing back against that. And I'm really excited that they're going to be organizing against it. So thank you for your time.
Thanks, Isaac. Thank you both for a fantastic introduction to what we're up against, and also some of the organizing that's pushing back against it. Our next two speakers are really going to offer a close look at some of the important mobilizations that have been going on over the last several years that April 17th is knitting together, and that we're going to use as a foundation for ongoing political mobilization to turn the tables. So I want to turn things over first to Brian Sachs, who is the president of the Rutgers Adjunct Faculty Union. Brian?
Thanks very much, Amy. It's really nice to be here with everybody. I wanted to talk for just about 6 or 7 minutes about the importance of cross-category, wall-to-wall organizing and confronting the higher ed crisis that you've just heard a lot about from Isaac and Afshan, and talk about how that wall-to-wall or cross-category organizing both benefited and presented some challenges for us at Rutgers. And then I just want to close with a brief polemic about what's to be done about some of the things that Afshan and Isaac have just mentioned. And so some of you will recall that Rutgers unions made headlines last spring for the strike that we brought against Rutgers administration, which was due to their unwillingness to bargain with us in a timely and urgent fashion. The strike won us one of the best adjunct contracts anywhere in the US, and both the strike and our gains were made possible, in my view, because we organized and bargained together. I'm talking about tenured faculty, medical faculty, non-tenured full-time faculty, postdocs, grad workers, educational counselors, and adjuncts, all of us bargaining and organizing together. We centered the demands of the most contingent and vulnerable for the duration of the campaign. And when, after months of stalling, the administration refused to move on our demands to make the contingent more secure, our unions undertook strike pledges and then strike authorization votes in unison. The result was record participation from our respective memberships and a 95% support rate for authorizing a strike. It turns out that adjuncts are emboldened to stand up for themselves when they see their tenured colleagues willing to stand up for them too. It was one of the most gratifying things about that experience for those of us leading our union. And I want to reiterate that the gains that we made were truly historic. I mean, we achieved near pay parity with our full-time non-tenure track colleagues. We made, by some estimates, 16 to 20 years of gains in just that 4-year contract. The aggregate raises that we're seeing for adjuncts in year 2 of our contract are 70, 80, even 90% above where they were just 2 years ago for hundreds of adjuncts. We've also seen unprecedented gains in job security for significant fractions of our non-tenure track full-time and adjunct members. And our adjunct union made huge gains in its density too. And all of this was directly attributable to our commitment to cross-category organizing. However, and at the first opportunity, as we've seen elsewhere across the country, Rutgers chancellors and deans began to innovate ways to undermine our gains as soon as the ink was dry. First, hundreds of adjuncts were threatened with non-payment of large retroactive salaries that they were due. Then, earlier this year, orders came down to cut instructional costs across dozens of departments by increasing class sizes, offering fewer sections, and even outright cutting course offerings. Just this past week, as I was writing up my remarks, in the nationally renowned writing program at Rutgers, which has one of the largest densities of contingent faculty anywhere, but at Rutgers for sure, enormous cuts were announced on the thinnest of pretexts, and they were announced at the precise moment that many adjuncts were set to see their first long-term contracts kick in. Many, quite understandably and with reason, see this as a retaliation against our contract victory, and one that's being undertaken without regard for the educational impact on students or their timely progress towards degrees. And from my perspective, in some ways, what's worst of all is that the same colleagues that adjuncts walked the picket lines with last year, many of whom are themselves contingent, non-tenured, full-time faculty, they're the ones being ordered by the dean's offices to lay off their adjunct colleagues. But we're fighting back, and we're fighting back in the same cross-category way to do this kind of contract protection that served us during the contract campaign. We recently held a cross-category town hall. It had 150 attendees there, during which union activists forcefully and really effectively demonstrated that the structural deficits that Rutgers is projecting misrepresent its true financial situation. And so folks left that meeting armed with new information, and now functioning in unison again, we're all feeling more empowered to protect contingent faculty and to protect students through joint collective action if necessary. And it may be necessary because there's no guarantee that what we're doing will be enough in the moment to make the administration pull back from needlessly firing dozens of us or more. And so with that just mini case study in mind, it brings me to my last point. And I mean this to be somewhat polemical in the spirit of the day here. And I'm thinking in particular of the bragging that Chris Rufo has done, that Isaac, so nicely referenced, right? About Rufo's, proof of concept related to the successful demonization campaigns that he and his political fellow travelers have undertaken. If we're going to achieve the future that we stand for in the face of a coordinated right-wing assault of the kind that you heard Afshan and Isaac so ably speak about, in my view, we must accept that so long as central administrations retain strong forms of managerial prerogative, our gains are always going to risk being undone, particularly our most critical job security gains. And to address this, we need nothing short of a wall-to-wall organizing effort that's bent on restructuring university governance. And we need this restructuring for a lot of reasons, but among them are that we're not going to be able to negotiate our way out of the opaque and punitive budget models that, that ones like responsibility-centered management that you may be familiar with, which place university departments under intense financial pressures that are designed to manufacture austerity and the need for cuts. We also need that restructuring because due to the funding, the historical funding of higher education that Jason will talk far better about than I will. Public university administrations have gravitated towards these like unsustainable debt financing schemes that penalize universities for offering job security and which reward them for keeping faculty and staff precariously employed. That's perverse. That's counter to the mission of the public university. I mean, without job security, there's no real academic freedom. We just can't accept this. And so in closing, those of us who are seeing our universities succumb to these forces, I think we have to prepare to make ourselves uncomfortable in ways that we so far may have been unwilling to. And in practice, that means, among other things, that those with the protections of tenure need to use them in service of the vulnerable. It means that non-tenured full-time faculty who are given managerial responsibility in departments, they've got to carefully consider the consequences of complying with manufactured justifications for cutting those that are more contingent than they are. And finally, it also means realizing that, again, from my view, central administrators in my practice basically see full-time faculty as contingent faculty in waiting. Confronting this means standing together for the common good. Faculty, staff, grad workers, researchers, students, community members, everyone. And this shouldn't be done out of pity or sorrow for the most insecure, because standing together protects and strengthens all of us. Remember that once the precarious are disposed of, the comfortable become newly vulnerable. And we can't let that happen. We can't let that happen if we want to deliver the future that we're here to stand for today. So thanks for listening.
Thank you, Brian. That was really great. Our last speaker is going to be Jason Wozniak, who is a higher ed researcher and organizer with the Debt Collective. Jason?
All right. Damn, y'all. You got me fired up here. All right. So you covered all the ground I wanted to cover. So I'm going to just dive into a couple key points here. I'm not going to read my notes. I'm going to highlight a couple of things that I heard and focus on debt. The first thing I want to say, Debt Collective. We believe strongly, along with our comrades here, higher education needs to be free, available to all, and we need to universally cancel student debt. No means testing. It should be canceled across the board. That's our position. That's what we've been fighting for the last 10 years, and we're winning some ground. In fact, I want to begin by saying it's really important, I think, to talk about what we're talking about here in the terms of counter-revolution. And if you look at the ways in which the response right now is a response to a higher education strike wave. Last year alone, 26 new bargaining units representing over 40,000 graduate student workers, postdoc workers, researchers earned certification under NLRB. We had 15 academic strikes in the United States in 2022. We won, before the Supreme Court stepped in, debt cancellation for millions of debtors. These are victories. We are advancing on the terrain of higher education. And I think one of the things that the right wing, as Isaac and other people have noted, is that Chris Rufo and friends have always situated higher education as a terrain of struggle. And so part of what's going on here is that we have been advancing and winning important victories on that terrain, and the right wing is pushing back in the ways that we've just heard. One of the key points of leverage and power that they hold over us is debt. And I want to just talk about this in two ways very quickly so that we have time for discussion. The student debt crisis is a result of policies that were put in place after the 1960s protests on campuses across the country. The right wing needed a way to discipline and control student movements, faculty movements that were gaining ground and ideologically making progress in different directions in American society. And so what happens is, the story is well known, so I'm not going to go over all of it. You have this shift from what some call a tax state to a debt state. In other words, you get drastic cuts in tax revenues And when the tax revenues go down, higher education has less funding available to it. And so higher education, both institutionally and the students that go to it, have to become reliant on debt in order to pay for access to higher education. This has an enormous influence over students. We have the student debt crisis predominantly impacting, or most impacting, women and BIPOC populations. In fact, 2/3 of the student debt load is held by women. But we need to conceptualize this not as an economic problem alone, but as a discipline and control governance tool. That's what debt does. It always has. If you look at what happened post-Civil War, debt was immediately imposed upon freed slaves in order to control the labor population, amongst other things. And so this is the key takeaway, that debt is a mechanism of discipline and control. It is an anti-democratic mechanism. Insofar as debt creates asymmetrical creditor-debtor relationships, and then debt drives a lot of the decision-making that's made in higher ed, as Brian just alluded to. So I want to talk just a little bit about this other debt crisis, which is institutional debt or university debt. This is absolutely fundamental. Again, remember, you have drastic cuts to higher education funding across the country, right? That means that institutions become more reliant on Wall Street loans, i.e. debt, in order to maintain operations, build capital projects, and other things. In fact, between 1989 to 2021, institutional debt rose by 482%. We're talking about a rise of $30 to $175 billion. In economic terms, that's a lot, but what we need to constantly come back to is, what does that mean politically? What does that mean for democratic governance? And how is that used to push austerity programs, used to cut and take out of faculty after wins like we heard about at Rutgers? In other words, what happens is university administrators are pressured by credit rating agencies and others to say, you have bond covenants you have to honor no matter what. You need to cut faculty, you need to cut programs in order to save money, in order to pay the creditor. They have to honor that bond covenant first. And so what ends up happening is, at the behest of maintaining high credit ratings, at the behest of serving Wall Street, the public gets shafted, faculty get shafted, contingent faculty especially. And so what's going on here is the ways that debt is being used as a bludgeon, as a way to control both students and as a way to push agendas in higher education governance. And I would argue that, you know, one of the things that Chris Rufo's come up a lot here, he said there were 3 points of leverage that they push on, and that this can be applied universally, right? So there's a media narrative leverage point, there's a financial point, and there's a political point. The financial point is very clear. The more dependent we are upon donors and or other sources of funding that don't come from the common good, the more they have power over us in moments like this. And what this means then is that we have to, if we're going to continue to build power on campuses and outside of campuses, I think this is a key thing, and I think Rutgers points this out, and other bargaining good for the common good practices demonstrate this, is that in order to continue to build power and hold ground and advance ground, we need to be able to cancel debts. We need, side by side with that, more funding to maintain the programs, to maintain the universities that we want and that we deserve. And so I'm just going to end it there by saying there's many events coming up that have already been mentioned. The Debt Collective has a direct action against student debt on May 22nd in Washington, D.C. And we also have a student debt release tool that over 40,000 people have filled out so far. I'll put it in the chat, which allows you to send a letter to the Department of Education and get, hopefully, debt canceled under hardship, economic hardship cause that's listed in the Higher Education Act. So join the Debt Collective, join the Higher Education Labor Union, support AAUP, show up to the protests. Let's cancel debt, because when we cancel debt, we have more power. That's all I'm going to say.
Thanks, Jason. That's a great introduction to a really powerful movement that, you're right, has absolutely made gains. And what we're seeing is a day to build on those. So let me open it up for questions. Please feel free to, raise your hand. I think I can probably see you. Yeah, Ryan.
Hey, my one question is, This day of action is coming on the same day that Columbia University's president is being called before Congress. Was that intentional, you guys scheduling this day of action on that particular day? And if it was intentional, why?
This day of action grew from conversations and meetings among higher ed unions, AAUP chapters, and student organizations that began last fall. And we scheduled it according to our priorities. This is a grassroots mobilization and a movement building effort. We chose mid-April because that was the day that we thought that the most campuses could participate. It's very important to understand that this year, one of the greatest victories of the opponents of higher education has to put the focus of the media on a few university presidents from extremely unusual Ivy League campuses and try to frame what is an attack on the democratic mission of higher education, an attack on students, an attack on faculty, an attack on staff as simply an attack on a few presidents of extremely unusual universities. Our day of action has absolutely nothing to do with the event that you referenced. It has everything to do with the movement building and strategizing of organizations that are using this really as a movement building event to build power that can turn the tables on really the threats that we face, which are broad anti-democratic threats, threats of corporate power, and threats of political interference that target us, that target the ability of universities to fulfill their mission of providing a broad education, of generating knowledge that's necessary for a democracy, of being spaces of open and free inquiry, of protest and mobilization that is necessary to a democratic society. That's what this is about, and that's why April 17th was chosen.
And just to clarify one last thing, that date was chosen even before Columbia University's president being called before Congress. Even before that was made public, this date was chosen.
It has nothing to do with that. It was chosen long before. As I said, we began planning this last fall. Are there other questions? Well, if that's the case, let me just put in the chat again, or maybe ask if Kelly, you can put in the chat again, the link to the website. Right now, there are 75 organizations participating. That number is going to continue to grow between now and next Wednesday. There are a lot of organizations that we know are going to participate. They just haven't fully finalized their plans. There are also some groups that we know have extremely big and powerful actions planned that they haven't yet publicly announced. So please stay tuned. We hope that you will cover what's happening on campuses around the country. I think that one of the most important purposes of the National Day of Action, one of them is movement building, as I mentioned, and we have follow-up meetings planned. We have follow-up organizing to build for the future. But another thing is to put the focus on the people who are really the targets of these attacks, the faculty, the students, the communities, the staff, and to highlight the real consequences of the attacks we're facing, as well as the mobilizations that are going to be necessary to turn the tables. I hope that this will not be a day of action that gets reported on simply as what is happening to university presidents. The university presidents are not the story here. So please, please feel free to be in touch if you want to find out more about the unions, the student organizations, and the AAUP chapters that are building for a new kind of higher education. Thanks very much, everyone.